Listen to this amazing story of miraculous healing. Enjoy listening. The rhythmic click of Daniel's mechanical keyboard was the soundtrack to his meticulously ordered life. Each keystroke, a tiny confirmation of control, of precision. At 49, Daniel Miller was an accountant, and he lived his profession. His home office, sanctuary of polished mahogany and neatly stacked financial journals, reflected his inner world. Organized, predictable, safe. Competitive birdwatching, his only real indulgence, was pursued with the same methodical diligence. Each sighting logged, each feather identified. His biggest aspiration, the zenith of his carefully plotted future, was to finally pay off Ilara's college loans. Then a quiet retirement, perhaps a cottage by a well-stocked feeder, and the undisturbed rustle of turning pages. Contentment hummed within him, a low, steady frequency. Mild anticipation for these golden years occasionally flickered, a controlled optimism that never quite tipped into recklessness. Ilara, his 22-year-old daughter, was a vibrant, chaotic splash of paint across his monochrome canvas. A budding environmental activist, she moved through life with the passionate disarray of a summer storm, leaving a trail of half-finished projects and fervent pronouncements. Their relationship was close, built on a foundation of exasperated affection. "Dad, you need to live a little," she'd often exclaim, gesturing wildly with hands still scented with compost. Daniel would nod, a faint, polite smile on his lips, then return to his meticulously balanced ledgers. His sister, Beatrice, 55, was another matter. A high-strung, pragmatic lawyer, she existed in a perpetual state of refined exasperation, always pushing Daniel to be more. "Daniel, you can't just disappear into your spreadsheets forever," she'd chastise, her voice a sharp, perfectly modulated instrument. "Life requires participation." He'd listen, of course, because Beatrice was family, but her urgings rarely penetrated the quiet satisfaction of his own well-worn grooves. He was content. He had his routine, his spreadsheets, his birds. What more could a man need? The first whisper of discord was a dull ache, a pebble in the well-oiled machinery of his left knee. Initially, Daniel dismissed it. Age, perhaps. A new ergonomic office chair, set at the wrong height. A misstep during his morning walk, though he couldn't recall one. He was a creature of habit, and his body, like his finances, was usually predictable. A mild annoyance, nothing more. He reached for the over-the-counter pain relievers, the familiar white pills offering temporary truce. But the ache persisted. It began to disrupt his daily walks. The familiar crunch of gravel underfoot replaced by a faint, persistent throb. Then it encroached upon his sleep. He'd shift, restless, seeking a position that offered respite, only to find the pain a stubborn, unyielding presence. Growing concern began to chip away at his composure, a slow, insidious denial attempting to patch the cracks. "It's just a strain," he'd murmur to himself, even as the throbbing grew sharper, more insistent, especially in the dead of night. Ilara, with her uncanny ability to perceive the unsaid, noticed the subtle limp that had begun to mar his otherwise precise gait. "Dad, what's wrong with your leg?" she demanded one evening, her brow furrowed with genuine worry. Daniel, ever the master of deflection, mumbled something about a pulled muscle. But Ilara was relentless. "It's been weeks. You're limping. You're tired. You need to see a doctor." Her insistence overriding his procrastination eventually wore him down. He reluctantly scheduled an appointment, still convinced it was nothing more than a minor inconvenience, a temporary blip in his perfectly balanced life. The waiting room was anathema to Daniel's love of order, a cacophony of hushed coughs, rustling magazines, and the distant wail of a child. He sat stiffly, his knee throbbing a low, rhythmic protest. The initial X-rays led to an MRI, then a needle biopsy, each step an increasingly unsettling departure from his comfortable world of certainties. The doctor, a kind-faced woman with tired eyes, delivered the news with a practiced gentleness that only underscored its brutality. "Mr. Miller, the pathology results are back," she began, her voice soft, but her words cutting through the air like shards of ice. "It's chondrosarcoma, grade 3. Daniel felt a strange detachment, as if the words were meant for someone else. Chondrosarcoma. He tried to process it, to file it away in a mental folder, but the label meant nothing. It was an unforeseen variable, a rogue element in his meticulously constructed grid. The doctor continued, her voice a low hum, explaining the aggressive nature of the bone cancer, its origin in the cartilage of his distal femur, its resistance to chemotherapy, his perfectly healthy body, betraying him. The concept was alien, terrifying. Ilara, who had insisted on accompanying him, gasped, a small, choked sound. Then, her face crumbling, she burst into tears, her usual vibrant energy dissolving into raw despair. But the breakdown was fleeting. Within moments, she had wiped her eyes, pulled out her phone, and was already shifting into research mode, her fingers flying across the screen, a flurry of frantic activity, searching for every possible alternative. Beatrice, ever the pragmatist, immediately took charge. Her face, usually so composed, was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't cry. Instead, she began to bark questions, her lawyer's mind already dissecting the situation, seeking solutions. What are the treatment protocols? What are the success rates? What about clinical trials? Her voice, though strained, was firm, a desperate attempt to impose order on the chaos that had just exploded in their lives. Daniel watched them, his daughter's frantic hope, his sister's desperate practicality, and felt a profound, chilling fear. His world, so carefully constructed, had just shattered. The dull ache, once a minor inconvenience, had become a life-altering crisis, an irreversible, terrifying equation. The rhythmic click of Daniel's mechanical keyboard was the soundtrack to his meticulously ordered life. Each keystroke, a tiny confirmation of control, of precision. At 49, Daniel Miller was an accountant, and he lived his profession. His home office, a sanctuary of polished mahogany and neatly stacked financial journals, reflected his inner world. Organized, predictable, safe. Competitive birdwatching, his only real indulgence, was pursued with the same methodical diligence, each sighting logged, each feather identified. His biggest aspiration, the zenith of his carefully plotted future, was to finally pay off Ilara's college loans. Then a quiet retirement, perhaps a cottage by a well-stocked feeder, and the undisturbed rustle of turning pages. Contentment hummed within him, a low, steady frequency. Mild anticipation for these golden years occasionally flickered, a controlled optimism that never quite tipped into recklessness. Ilara, his 22-year-old daughter, was a vibrant, chaotic splash of paint across his carefully drawn lines. A budding environmental activist, her passion was as untamed as his precision was refined. Their relationship was close, built on a foundation of mutual respect and exasperated affection. "Dad, you need to loosen up," she'd declare, tossing her bright, tangled hair as he meticulously aligned a stack of tax returns. "Ilara, chaos is the enemy of progress," he'd respond, a faint smile playing on his lips. His sister Beatrice, 55, a high-strung, pragmatic lawyer, was another voice in the symphony of his life, albeit a more strident one. "Daniel, you're too comfortable," she'd often admonish, her sharp eyes assessing his quiet contentment. "You need to be more, achieve more. Life isn't just about spreadsheets and finches." He'd simply nod, acknowledging her well-meaning but ultimately irrelevant advice. His world was, to him, perfect. Then a subtle discord began to hum beneath the surface of his carefully orchestrated existence. It started as a phantom ache, a dull throb in his left knee, easy enough to dismiss. He'd attributed it to the new ergonomic office chair Ilara had insisted he buy. "Better for your posture, Dad." Or perhaps a misstep during his morning constitutional, a brisk walk around the neighborhood the precise length of 2 miles. Annoyance was his primary emotion. This was an unwelcome variable in his perfectly calibrated routine. He tried the usual remedies. Ibuprofen became a morning ritual, washed down with his perfectly brewed coffee. For a few hours the ache would recede, a temporary truce in this minor inconvenience. But it was a persistent enemy, always returning, a low-grade hum that gradually escalated into a sharper, more insistent throb. It began to disrupt his sleep, pulling him from his dreams of perfectly balanced ledgers and rare bird sightings. He'd shift positions, prop a pillow under his knee, but the pain gnawed, a restless dog refusing to settle. He started limping. Not a pronounced, dramatic limp, but a subtle hitch in his gait, noticeable only to those who knew his precise movements. Ilara, with her uncanny ability to perceive the unsaid, was the first to comment. "Dad, what's with the hobble?" she asked one evening, her brow furrowing with concern. "Just a bit of a strain," he mumbled, waving away her worry. "Old age, I suppose." He hated the admission, the idea that his body, this reliable vehicle, was beginning to falter. But the pain escalated, relentless and unforgiving. It felt like a deep, internal bruise, throbbing with its own rhythm, especially at night. Sleep became a luxury, stolen in short, fitful bursts. His morning walks, once a precise exercise in discipline, became a painful ordeal he dreaded. He found himself avoiding stairs, favoring his right leg, each movement a conscious effort to minimize the sharp jabs of pain. The mild annoyance had morphed into a growing concern, gnawing at the edges of his meticulously ordered world. Denial clung to him like a second skin. It had to be a pulled muscle, a stubborn inflammation, nothing more. "Dad, you're still limping," Ilara said, her voice laced with an unusual firmness. She had followed him from the kitchen, watching him wince as he lowered himself into his armchair. "This isn't just a strain anymore. You need to see a doctor." He sighed, a familiar wave of procrastination washing over him. Medical appointments were an inefficiency, a disruption to his schedule. "I'll get around to it, Ilara," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "No, you won't," she countered, pulling out her phone. "I'm making you an appointment. Now, Dr. Evans, he's supposed to be good." Before he could protest, she was already speaking into the phone, her voice brisk and determined. He watched her, a mix of exasperation and reluctant gratitude stirring within him. He was a man who meticulously planned every detail, yet here was his daughter, overriding his procrastination, forcing him to confront this unwelcome, unforeseen variable. He knew deep down she was right. The pain wasn't going away. It was insisting on being acknowledged, demanding attention. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt a tremor of something he rarely experienced: fear. The series of appointments that followed became a blur of sterile rooms, cold machines, and hushed voices. X-rays, then an MRI. The initial doctor, a kind but hairy general practitioner, had looked at the scans with a troubled expression. "There's something here, Daniel. We need to investigate further." The words hung in the air, a chilling premonition. Then came the biopsy, a brutal invasion of his body, a needle plunged deep into his bone, extracting a piece of his very essence for examination. The waiting was the worst part, a torturous limbo where his analytical mind kept replaying every possible scenario, each more terrifying than the last. When Dr. Evans, an oncologist with kind eyes but a weary demeanor, finally delivered the news, the words seemed to lose all meaning. "Daniel, the biopsy confirms it's chondrosarcoma, grade 3, aggressive." The meticulously constructed world of Daniel Miller shattered. The rhythmic click of his keyboard, the precise alignment of his spreadsheets, the quiet joy of his birdwatching, all of it crumbled into dust. Chondrosarcoma, bone cancer, in his distal femur. The words were a foreign language, alien to his perfectly healthy, predictable body. He heard the doctor explain the grim details. Aggressive, rare, notoriously resistant to chemotherapy. Surgery was an option, maybe radiation, but the prognosis was bleak. He was a creature of logic, of facts and figures. But these facts were illogical, a cruel joke played by a universe he thought he understood. Disbelief warred with a crushing wave of fear. His mind, usually so sharp, felt dull, incapable of processing the enormity of it all. Anger simmered beneath the surface. Anger at his body for betraying him, at the unfairness of it all, and vulnerability, a raw, exposed feeling he rarely permitted himself. Ilara, sitting beside him, had let out a choked sob. Her face, usually so vibrant, was now pale and streaked with tears. But almost immediately she shifted. Her grief morphed into a furious determination. "No," she whispered, wiping her eyes. "No. There has to be something. We'll find it. Every alternative, every clinical trial, everything. She pulled out her phone, her fingers already flying across the screen, a new kind of activism ignited within her. Beatrice, who had arrived as soon as Daniel called, was a study in controlled chaos. Her lawyer's composure was strained, her hands gripping her purse so tightly her knuckles were white. "Okay," she said, her voice a little too high-pitched. "Okay, specialists, second opinions. We need to know the financial implications. Insurance. We'll fight this, Daniel. We'll fight." Her pragmatic solutions felt hollow, a desperate attempt to impose order on an utterly disordered reality. She kept glancing at him, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and a desperate struggle to maintain her composure. Daniel just sat there, numb, the sterile office fading around him. The dull ache in his knee, once a minor annoyance, had morphed into a monstrous, life-altering crisis. His perfectly ordered life, his quiet aspirations, his future with Alara, and his beloved birds, all of it was now overshadowed by the unforeseen variable, the aggressive, relentless enemy that had taken root in his very bone. The meticulous grid was gone, replaced by a terrifying, chaotic void. The dull ache in Daniel's left knee, which had been a persistent, if ignorable, companion for weeks, had escalated into a relentless throb. He'd initially dismissed it, a minor inconvenience in the carefully choreographed ballet of his days. Perhaps it was his new ergonomic office chair, he'd mused, or a clumsy misstep during a particularly enthusiastic birdwatching foray. Over-the-counter pain relievers offered fleeting truce, a brief respite before the dull roar returned, louder each time. It began to haunt his nights, a phantom limb of discomfort that stole sleep, leaving him groggy and irritable. His meticulous charts, usually a source of calm, now blurred at the edges of his vision. Even the precise art of identifying a rare warbler felt tainted by the insistent pain. Ilari, with her inconveniently sharp observations, was the first to truly notice the shift. "Dad, you're limping," she'd stated one evening, her voice devoid of judgment, but brimming with a concern that grated on Daniel's carefully maintained composure. He'd brushed it off, of course, a minor strain, nothing to worry about. But Alara, with the stubborn tenacity of a budding environmental activist, wouldn't let it go. She hounded him, overriding his procrastination, until he finally, reluctantly, scheduled an appointment with Dr. Aris, his general practitioner. Daniel disliked doctors. They were an unpredictable variable in his predictable world. The first appointment had been unremarkable. Dr. Aris, a kind but harried man, had poked and prodded, prescribed stronger anti-inflammatories, and ordered an X-ray, just to be safe. Daniel had left the clinic feeling vaguely annoyed, convinced he was wasting everyone's time. But the X-ray results led to an MRI, and the MRI to a biopsy. Each step, a tightening noose around his sense of control. The summons to Dr. Aris's office came on a Tuesday afternoon, a day Daniel had scheduled for a deep dive into Q3 projections. He arrived punctually, still clinging to the illusion of normalcy. The sterile white walls of the consultation room seemed to hum with an unspoken tension. Dr. Aris, usually so affable, looked grim. He gestured for Daniel to sit, his movements unusually slow. "Daniel," he began, his voice softer than usual. The biopsy results came back. Daniel's stomach lurched. He braced himself, a lifetime of preparing for the worst, even when he believed it would never come. He expected a diagnosis of a torn ligament, perhaps a complicated fracture, something fixable. "It's a form of bone cancer, Daniel," Dr. Aris continued, his gaze unwavering. "Chondrosarcoma, grade 3. It's aggressive, originating in your distal femur." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow, stripping the air from his lungs. Cancer, not a strain, not a fracture. Cancer, aggressive. His perfectly healthy body, the one he'd nurtured with precise diets and regular walks, was betraying him. The meticulous grid of his life had just been shattered by an unforeseen variable. He felt a cold dread seep into his bones, far deeper than any physical ache. Chondrosarcoma. The term sounded alien, monstrous. He vaguely heard Dr. Aris explain the nuances, its origin in cartilage, the severe localized pain it caused, the progressive loss of mobility, the eventual systemic symptoms as it metastasized. He heard chemotherapy-resistant and rare, each word a chisel chipping away at the bedrock of his existence. He gripped the arms of the chair, his knuckles white. Disbelief warred with a primal fear. Anger, too, a hot, bitter surge. How could this happen? To him? His phone buzzed. It was Alara. He'd told her he had a follow-up, nothing serious. He stared at the screen, unable to answer. He felt vulnerable, exposed, a raw nerve. When he finally called Alara, struggling to get the words out, her immediate reaction was a choked gasp, followed by the sound of something crashing in the background. Then the silence. Then a sharp, almost manic energy. No, Dad. We'll fix this. There have to be alternatives. I'll start researching. Every clinic, every trial, every single thing, I'll find it. Her voice cracked, but the determination was fierce, almost frightening. Daniel could almost see her already hunched over her laptop, a whirlwind of frantic energy, trying to impose order on chaos just as he would. Beatrice, his sister, was a different storm entirely. He called her next, bracing himself. Her usual high-strung pragmatism dissolved into a shocked silence, then a clipped, almost breathy, "Oh, Daniel, oh my God." He could hear the tremor in her voice, a rare crack in her composed facade. "Right, specialists. I'll call Professor Davies at Sloan Kettering and Dr. Chen at Mayo. We need to explore every option. Financial implications. Don't you worry about that. We'll sort it. We'll find a way." She was already in lawyer mode, problem-solving, her voice a little too loud, a little too fast, betraying the fear she was trying to contain. He heard her fumbling for her planner, the rustle of papers. Daniel hung up, the phone feeling heavy in his hand. His meticulously constructed world lay in ruins around him. The quiet retirement, the competitive birdwatching, the satisfaction of paying off Ilara's loans. All of it seemed to vanish into a chilling void. The dull ache in his knee, now identified as a monstrous entity, no longer felt dull. It throbbed with a new, terrifying intensity, a constant reminder of the unforeseen variable that had just rewritten the equation of his life. The sterile white walls of the recovery room blurred into a monotonous expanse, mirroring the fog in Daniel's mind. The chondrosarcoma, the aggressive bone cancer that had shattered his neatly ordered world, had been excised, but at a cost. His left leg, once a dependable pillar, now lay encased in a cumbersome brace, a monument to the invasive surgery he'd endured. The ache in his knee, once a dull throb, had escalated into a searing, persistent fire that painkillers only muted, never extinguished. He tried to remember the precise details of the procedure, the percentages, the probabilities, but the pain, a constant, insidious presence, devoured his capacity for meticulous thought. Physical therapy began grimly. Each flexion, each extension, was a battle against the agony that radiated from his distal femur. The therapist, a young woman with a perpetually cheerful demeanor that grated on Daniel's raw nerves, would push, gently but firmly, and Daniel would bite back a groan, his face a mask of strained politeness. He'd meticulously tracked his progress in his mind, noting the agonizingly slow inching towards mobility. But the gains were minuscule, the pain ever present, a constant reminder of his body's betrayal. His once dependable leg, now a source of chronic pain and disability, felt like a foreign entity, a statistical anomaly gone horribly wrong. The post-operative consultations were even more brutal than the surgery itself. Dr. Albright, the oncologist, sat across from him, his voice a low, measured drone as he delivered the stark reality. Microscopic residual disease. The words hung in the air, dense and heavy, suffocating. The nature of chondrosarcoma, Mr. Miller, especially grade 3, means it's highly resistant to conventional chemotherapy and radiation. We removed what we could, but it's tenacious. He spoke of low success rates for further aggressive treatments, of managing symptoms, of quality of life. Palliative care, the phrase echoed, hollow and final. Daniel felt a profound disillusionment wash over him. His life had been a series of solvable problems, of variables that could be accounted for, balanced, controlled. But this was an equation with no solution, a spreadsheet riddled with unfillable cells. He was a statistic, a data point in a grim clinical trial, and the realization was soul-crushing. He watched Beatrice, her face pale but composed, scribble notes on a pad, her lawyer's mind already calculating the next move, the next specialist. Ilara, her eyes red-rimmed but resolute, clutched his hand, her youthful optimism a stark contrast to the bleak prognosis. They spoke of clinical trials, of alternative medicines, of hope, but Daniel felt none of it. He felt trapped, pinned beneath the weight of his own failing biology, a helpless observer as his carefully constructed future crumbled. He started to resent his own body. The very framework that had carried him through 49 years of meticulously lived life was now a cage of pain and limitation. He'd always prided himself on his self-discipline, his ability to control his environment. But this was beyond his control. He'd followed the rules, lived a healthy life, paid his taxes, balanced his books. Yet here he was, staring down a future defined by a disease that couldn't be quantified, couldn't be reasoned with, couldn't be fixed. The medical system, the bastion of scientific rigor he had always trusted, seemed to shrug, offering only managed decline. The despair was a cold, creeping tide, threatening to engulf him entirely. He saw the concern in Ilara's eyes, the frustration in Beatrice's, but their frantic problem-solving felt futile, a desperate dance on the edge of an abyss. He was tired of the pain, tired of the helplessness, tired of being the problem that no one, not even the most brilliant minds, could solve. His world had narrowed to the circumference of his pain, and the overwhelming sense of entrapment was a constant, suffocating companion. The sterile white walls of the recovery room had blurred into the familiar, yet increasingly oppressive, confines of his own bedroom. The surgical scar on Daniel's left leg, a jagged, angry testament to the battle waged and lost, pulsed with a dull, incessant ache. It was a constant companion, this pain, a physical manifestation of the despair that had begun to settle over him like a suffocating blanket. The cumbersome brace, a relic of his attempts at physical therapy, lay discarded in a corner, gathering dust. He'd tried in those first few weeks after the surgery to cling to the fragments of his old life. He'd gone to the physical therapy appointments, enduring the excruciating stretches and bends, motivated by a desperate, dwindling hope. But the post-op consultations had extinguished that flicker. Dr. Anya Sharma, his oncologist, a woman with kind eyes but a voice that delivered facts with the precise, chilling clarity of a forensic report, had laid out the stark reality. Daniel, the surgery was successful in removing the bulk of the tumor. However, and here her voice softened almost imperceptibly, the margins, they weren't entirely clear, and the pathology report confirms microscopic residual disease. Given the grade and aggressive nature of chondrosarcoma and its known resistance to conventional chemotherapy, our options are extremely limited. We're looking at continued palliative care to manage symptoms, but a full cure at this stage is highly improbable. Highly improbable. The words echoed in Daniel's mind, each syllable a nail in the coffin of his future. He wasn't a fool. He understood medical terminology. He was a statistic, a data point in a grim prognosis. The meticulous grid of his life had been shattered, replaced by an unpredictable, terrifying void. He tried to reconcile this broken man with the Daniel who had meticulously balanced ledgers, identified obscure finches, and planned his retirement down to the last penny. The disconnect was unbearable. The chronic pain was a relentless hammer, not just on his leg, but on his spirit. Each movement was an effort, each step a reminder of his failing body. The physical therapy, once a grudging obligation, became an unbearable torment. What was the point, he'd argued with the perpetually cheerful therapist, if the outcome was already predetermined? He'd stopped going. The calls from the clinic went unanswered, their chipper tones grating on his raw nerves. His once immaculate home office, the sanctuary where numbers made sense and order prevailed, had become a mausoleum of broken ambition. Financial journals lay scattered, their pages unread. His beloved bird guides, once meticulously organized by species and region, were buried under a growing pile of medical bills and unopened mail. Dust motes danced in the anemic sunlight, filtering through the blinds he rarely bothered to open. He found himself staring at the wall for hours, the vibrant world outside shrinking to the oppressive confines of his despair. Ilara, his passionate, chaotic daughter, tried everything. She brought him his favorite Earl Grey tea, perfectly brewed. She tried to engage him in his old hobbies, placing a new edition of The Sibley Guide to Birds on his bedside table. "Dad," she'd pleaded one afternoon, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Remember that rare red-breasted nuthatch we saw at the wetlands? We could go. Just for an hour. It might help." Daniel had merely grunted, turning his face to the wall. The thought of walking, of even sitting in the cold, damp air, was exhausting. His bird-watching binoculars, once extensions of his meticulous gaze, felt like lead weights. The vibrant colors of the avian world now seemed distant, mocking. His future, he was convinced, was nothing but a slow, agonizing fade to black. Beatrice, his sister, ever the pragmatist, fared no better. She arrived armed with printouts of obscure clinical trials in Germany, a list of alternative healers, and even once, a brightly colored pamphlet for a support group. "Daniel, you can't just give up," she'd exhorted, her voice a little too sharp, a little too close to desperation. "There are options. We'll find something. We'll fight this." But her words, once pillars of strength, now sounded hollow, echoing in the vast emptiness of his apathy. Her pragmatic solutions, her relentless drive, bounced off the impenetrable wall of his emotional withdrawal. He just wanted to be left alone, to disappear into the comfortable oblivion of his pain and despair. He neglected his personal hygiene, the once crisp shirts replaced by sweatpants and a worn t-shirt. The scent of stale air and unwashed clothes hung heavy in the room. His carefully constructed world hadn't just shattered, it had dissolved, leaving him adrift in a sea of misery. The surgical scar was a constant reminder, not of a battle won, but of a body betrayed, a future stolen. He was a man consumed by the diagnosis, a prisoner in his own deteriorating flesh, watching the last vestiges of his light dim, convinced his life and all meaning within it was over. He was an accountant without accounts to balance, a bird watcher with no desire to see the sky. He was simply Daniel, 49, dying, and he felt utterly, terrifyingly alone. The sterile white walls of the recovery room had blurred into the familiar, yet increasingly oppressive, confines of his own bedroom. The surgical scar on Daniel's left leg, a jagged, angry testament to the battle waged and lost, pulsed with a dull, incessant ache. It was a constant companion, this pain, a physical manifestation of the despair that had begun to settle over him like a suffocating blanket. The cumbersome brace, a relic of his attempts at physical therapy, lay discarded in a corner, gathering dust. He'd tried in those first few weeks after the surgery to cling to the fragments of his old life. He'd gone to the physical therapy appointments, enduring the excruciating stretches and bends, motivated by a desperate, dwindling hope. But the post-op consultations had extinguished that flicker. Dr. Anya Sharma, his oncologist, a woman with kind eyes but a voice that delivered facts with the precise, chilling clarity of a forensic report, had laid out the stark reality. "Daniel," she'd said, her voice soft but firm, "despite the wide resection, the pathology showed microscopic margins. Chondrosarcoma, especially grade 3, it's tenacious. We're looking at a very high likelihood of recurrence. Chemotherapy and radiation, as we discussed, are largely ineffective against this type." She then detailed palliative options, the clinical trials with grim success rates, and the importance of pain management. Daniel had felt a cold, hard knot form in his gut. He wasn't a fighter. He was an accountant. He dealt with numbers, with predictable outcomes. This was chaos, an equation he couldn't balance. He was a statistic, reduced to a percentage point on a survival curve. The carefully constructed spreadsheet of his life had been shredded. The following weeks bled into months, an unbroken continuum of pain and apathy. The meticulously organized home office, once his sanctuary, became a tomb. Financial journals lay haphazardly. Bird guides remained unopened. The dust motes dancing in the infrequent shafts of sunlight seemed more alive than he felt. He stopped attending physical therapy. "What's the point?" he'd snapped at Alara when she gently reminded him of an appointment. "So I can prolong this existence? So I can walk a few more painful steps to the inevitable?" Alara, usually so resilient, looked defeated. She tried everything. She brought him his favorite obscure birdwatching documentaries, but he only stared blankly at the screen. She tried to engage him in discussions about her environmental activism, the passionate fire that usually drew him out of himself, but he just grunted noncommittally. "Dad, please," she'd pleaded one afternoon, sitting on the edge of his unmade bed, her voice cracking. "You can't just give up. You're Daniel. You fix things. You find solutions." He turned his face to the wall. "Some things can't be fixed, Alara. Some things just break." Beatrice, ever the pragmatist, fared no better. She tried to coax him with talk of experimental treatments abroad, of second opinions, of legal avenues for disability claims. Her voice, usually so crisp and authoritative, became tinged with desperation. "Daniel, pull yourself together. This isn't like you. You've always been so resilient." "Resilience is for spreadsheets, B," he'd mumbled, his voice raspy from disuse. "Not for microscopic margins and cancer cells." He knew he was hurting them, pushing them away, but he couldn't help it. Their hope felt like a burden, a demand he couldn't meet. He hated the pity in their eyes, the forced cheerfulness. He wanted to be left alone with his pain, his despair. The smell of his own unwashed body, the stale air in the room, the unkempt beard. It was all a reflection of his internal landscape. His life, he was sure, was over. Alara, however, was not one to entirely give up. She remembered scattered anecdotes from her grandmother, stories of a secluded community nestled deep in the redwood forests, known for their unusual approach to life and healing. They were called the Viridian Collective, whispered about in hushed tones, often dismissed as eccentric or even cultish. But one name stood out in her grandmother's recollections: Dr. Eris Thorne. Not a medical doctor, her grandmother had been quick to clarify, but a retired ethnobotanist, a philosopher, a quiet man revered for his radical empathy and his work with individuals facing terminal illness. He didn't offer cures, her grandmother had always said, but something deeper. Knowing her father's ingrained skepticism, Alara approached him cautiously. One blustery afternoon, when Daniel had actually managed to drag himself to the living room and stare out the window, she casually mentioned, "You know, I was talking to Grandma the other day. She mentioned that old community, the Viridian Collective. You used to be so fascinated by their sustainable farming practices when you were a kid." Daniel grunted, a flicker of something in his eyes. He did remember. He'd pored over articles about their self-sufficient systems, their unique crop rotation methods. It was the only unconventional thing that had ever truly piqued his meticulous interest. "She also said they have someone there," Alara continued, watching him carefully. "A Dr. Thorne, not a medical doctor, but apparently he helps people find a way through difficult times, especially when there aren't any conventional solutions left." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Grandma said he focuses on finding purpose, even when everything else seems lost." Daniel remained silent for a long moment, the wind rattling the window pane. "Purpose?" he scoffed, the word tasting bitter. "My purpose now is to manage this slow decline." "Maybe it's not about fighting the decline, Dad," Alara suggested, her voice barely a whisper. "Maybe it's about finding a different kind of growth within it." She pulled out her phone. "I found an old article about him. It talks about something called transcendent service. It's not about miracle cures, Dad. It's about, well, it sounds like he helps people find a reason to keep living, even when they're dying." Daniel looked at her then, his eyes once so sharp, now dull and clouded. "Transcendent service," he repeated, a dry, humorless chuckle escaping his lips. "Sounds like something out of a self-help guru's pamphlet. You know how I feel about that nonsense, Alara. His voice was laced with his usual intellectual disdain for anything not quantifiable. "I know, Dad," she said, her voice gentle. "But what do you have to lose? It's not a cure. It's just a different perspective. And Grandma always said he was incredibly intelligent, very grounded, not at all what you'd expect." The next day, Ilara drove him, against his initial protests, to the edge of the redwood forest. The air was crisp, scented with pine and damp earth. Dr. Eris Thorne met them at a modest, rustic cabin. He was a man in his late 60s, with kind, crinkled eyes that seemed to hold ancient knowledge, a neatly trimmed silver beard, and a quiet, unassuming demeanor. He wore simple, functional clothes, and his hands, Ilara noticed, were calloused like a gardener's. He didn't offer platitudes or false hope. He simply listened as Ilara, then Daniel, haltingly explained the situation. When Daniel finished, his voice hoarse, Dr. Thorne nodded slowly. "Daniel," he said, his voice calm and surprisingly deep, "I offer no panaceas, no medical interventions. My work is not with the body in the way a surgeon or an oncologist works. My philosophy, as your daughter mentioned, is that true healing isn't always about extending life, but expanding it. Finding meaning, purpose, connection, even in the face of our impermanence." He paused, his gaze steady. "We have a program here, what we call transcendent service. It's not for everyone. It requires a willingness to look beyond oneself, to find solace in the burdens of others." Daniel scoffed again, a more pronounced sound this time. "You mean playing therapist for strangers?" Dr. Thorne smiled faintly. "Not exactly. It's about offering what you have, your unique skills, your attention, your presence, to those who are also struggling in ways that are often overlooked. It might be helping a visually impaired elder organize their belongings, or assisting a single parent with navigating bureaucratic paperwork. Mundane tasks, perhaps, but done with a focus on deep listening and connection. We believe that by easing the load of another, even in a small way, we lighten our own." Daniel was skeptical, profoundly so. It sounded like glorified volunteer work, a distraction. But there was something in Dr. Thorne's calm, non-judgmental presence that kept him from outright dismissing it. No forced optimism, no spiritual jargon, just a quiet invitation. And the idea of lightening one's own load, the phrase resonated with the accountant in him, a strange, emotional balance sheet. He had nothing left to lose, did he? His life was already a write-off. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was a different kind of profit to be found. And what exactly would I, an accountant with a bum leg and a terminal diagnosis, be able to offer? He finally asked, the question laced with bitter resignation, but also, for the first time in months, a faint flicker of curiosity. Dr. Thorne's eyes twinkled. "Perhaps a great deal, Daniel. More than you can imagine." Ilara's voice, a mixture of gentle coaxing and barely suppressed desperation, had been the last coherent sound Daniel registered before the haze of apathy descended completely. He remembered snippets. Dr. Thorne, ethnobotanist. Not a cure, Dad, just different. Different. Everything was different now, and not in any way he'd ever planned. The familiar scent of lemon polish and old paper that once defined his home office had been replaced by the stale tang of unwashed laundry and the faint metallic scent of his own lingering illness. His meticulous grid, the lifeblood of his financial world, lay dormant on his laptop, a digital tombstone to a life that no longer existed. He'd agreed eventually. More accurately, he'd ceased to resist. Ilara, with her quiet persistence, had simply shown up with Dr. Thorne one afternoon. Daniel had remained on the sofa, a permanent fixture in the dim light of the living room, a blanket draped over his still-aching leg. Dr. Thorne hadn't preached or promised. He hadn't even mentioned the cancer, a fact that both irritated and strangely intrigued Daniel. Instead, he'd spoken of transcendent service, of finding expansion in unexpected places. A quiet, almost meditative rhythm to his words that cut through Daniel's usual mental clamor. He hadn't offered a miracle, but an invitation to participate, to simply do. And Daniel, with nothing left to lose, had found himself, weeks later, sitting in the passenger seat of Alara's battered hybrid, headed toward an unfamiliar part of town. His first assignment felt like a practical joke. Mrs. Gable, Dr. Thorne had explained in his calm, unhurried voice during their brief introductory meeting, is a remarkable woman, blind since birth, but her mind is sharp as a tack. She just struggles with organization. Her pantry, specifically. Daniel, the king of the organized spreadsheet, the meticulous categorizer of all things numerical, was being asked to sort cans of soup. He'd scoffed internally, a bitter laugh caught in his throat. This was transcendent service? It felt like penance. The small, slightly cluttered house smelled of lavender and old books. Mrs. Gable, a woman with a kind, crinkled face and eyes that, though sightless, seemed to hold a vast reservoir of understanding, greeted him with a warm smile. Dr. Thorne said, "You're quite the organizer, Daniel," she said, her voice soft. "My apologies for the state of affairs. Things just get away from me sometimes." Daniel grunted a non-committal reply. He entered the pantry, a small space crammed floor to ceiling with an assortment of jars, boxes, and cans. It was chaos, a stark contrast to his own perfectly aligned spice rack. He began methodically to pull everything out, creating piles on the kitchen floor, canned goods, dried pasta, spices. His accountant's brain, dormant for weeks, flickered to life. He started categorizing, visualizing the layout he would implement. Spaghetti with spaghetti sauce, logically. Canned peas with canned corn. As he worked, Mrs. Gable sat at her kitchen table, humming softly. After a while, she began to talk. Not to him, not directly, but aloud, a stream of consciousness that flowed around him. She spoke of her late husband, a quiet man who had always kept the pantry in perfect order. She spoke of her grandchildren, who visited less and less now that they were grown. She spoke of the loneliness that crept in with the twilight and the small victories of each day. The perfectly brewed cup of tea, the familiar feel of her worn knitting needles. Daniel, initially focused solely on the labels and expiration dates, found his attention drifting. He listened. He heard the tremor in her voice when she spoke of her husband, the wistful sigh when she mentioned her grandchildren. He heard the quiet dignity in her recounting of daily struggles. Without realizing it, he found himself responding, not with advice, but with simple, quiet affirmations. I see. That sounds lovely." When he had finished, the pantry was a model of efficiency. Cans were aligned, labels facing forward. Spices were alphabetized. Pasta was in clearly labeled containers. Mrs. Gable ran her hands over the shelves, her fingers tracing the outlines of the newly organized items. "Oh, Daniel," she whispered, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. It's perfect. He would have loved it." She reached out, her hand finding his, her grip surprisingly strong. "Thank you, not just for the organizing, but for listening." A strange warmth bloomed in Daniel's chest, unfamiliar and unexpected. It wasn't the relief of finishing a particularly complex tax return, nor the fleeting satisfaction of a perfectly balanced ledger. This was different, lighter. His next assignment was equally unconventional. Mark, a young single father, overwhelmed by anxiety and struggling to keep his head above water. His apartment was a testament to his mental state. Bills scattered, rent notices mixed with overdue utility statements, receipts spilling from every surface. Daniel felt a perverse surge of familiarity. This was his territory, financial chaos. Mark, a gaunt man with perpetually worried eyes, seemed wary at first. "Dr. Thorne said you could help me sort things out," he mumbled, gesturing vaguely at the mountainous piles of paper. "We can start anywhere," Daniel said, surprised by the steady calm in his own voice. He pulled out a legal pad and a pen, a familiar comfort in his hand. "Let's begin with the rent." For the next 3 hours, Daniel immersed himself in Mark's financial labyrinth. He separated bills from junk mail, created categories for expenses, and even helped Mark draft a polite but firm letter to a landlord about a disputed charge. As Daniel worked, Mark, initially quiet, began to open up. He spoke of his fears, losing his job, not being able to provide for his daughter, the suffocating weight of his debt. He spoke of his ex-wife, his struggles with depression, and the constant, gnawing worry that he was failing. Daniel, his fingers stained with ink from old receipts, found himself listening again. He heard the raw pain in Mark's voice, the desperation that echoed his own recent despair. But this time, he wasn't dwelling on his own suffering. He was focused on Mark's. He offered practical advice, yes, budget templates, tips for negotiating with creditors. But he also offered something else, a non-judgmental ear. "It sounds incredibly difficult, Mark," Daniel said softly at one point, looking up from a particularly convoluted bank statement. "And you're still here, still fighting for your daughter. That's remarkable." Mark paused, his eyes wide. He hadn't heard such simple, unadorned acknowledgement in a long time. A tremor went through him, and he wiped a tear from his eye. "No one's ever said that before," he whispered. "They just tell me to pull myself together." By the time Daniel left, the apartment was still far from pristine, but the financial chaos had been tamed. A stack of neatly organized folders sat on the kitchen table, a coherent path forward laid out. Mark looked exhausted, but a faint, almost imperceptible lightness seemed to have settled over him. As Daniel walked out into the crisp afternoon air, his legs still ached, a constant throb that served as a cruel reminder of the cancer. But the ache felt different. It was still there, undeniable, yet it no longer consumed him. It was a background noise, not the screaming siren it had been for months. His mind, instead of circling the drain of his own impending doom, was filled with Mrs. Gable's quiet dignity and Mark's nascent hope. He found himself thinking about the simple act of listening, of bringing order to someone else's chaos. It was a different kind of balance sheet, he realized, one where the debits were his own pain and the credits were the small, unexpected moments of connection, of shared burdens, of seeing the world not through the lens of his own suffering, but through the eyes of others. And in that strange, paradoxical exchange, a faint, undeniable lightness began to take root within him. His own burden, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, had lessened. The familiar agony, a searing, gnawing fire in his left femur, returned with a vengeance. It wasn't the dull ache he'd grown accustomed to, nor the throbbing discomfort that often accompanied his attempts at movement. This was a supernova of pain, radiating from deep within the bone, consuming his entire leg, then his torso, then his mind. It was the kind of pain that stole breath, blurred vision, and reduced him to a primal, gasping shell. He'd been halfway through explaining to Mrs. Henderson, a woman he'd helped organize her late husband's sprawling collection of vintage stamps, how a proper humidification system would prevent further deterioration when the first spasm hit. One moment, he was meticulously categorizing early Victorian penny blacks. The next, he was collapsing, a strangled cry tearing from his throat, the stamp album scattering around him. Ilara found him, curled on the floor, sweat plastering his hair to his forehead, his face ashen. Her frantic call to Beatrice, then to the emergency services, was a blur of panicked urgency. The ambulance ride to St. Jude's Medical Center was an ordeal of bumps and jolts, each one sending fresh waves of agony through his already shattered body. Morphine, administered by a calm-faced paramedic, finally brought a blessed, if fleeting, reprieve. He woke in a hospital bed, the sterile scent of antiseptic assaulting his nose. The fluorescent lights hummed with an irritating buzz. The pain, though dulled by medication, was a persistent, malevolent drone beneath the surface. Dr. Sharma, looking more harried than usual, stood at the foot of his bed, her medical charts a barrier between them. "Daniel," she said, her voice softer than usual, "we've run some new scans. The progression is significant. The tumor has grown, and there are signs of spread to the lungs. It's aggressive, as we knew it would be." Her words were a death knell, a confirmation of the inevitable. The old Daniel would have crumbled, a statistical failure in a world that demanded success. He would have felt the icy grip of despair, the bitter taste of resignation. But the new Daniel, forged in the crucible of Mrs. Henderson's cluttered pantry and Mr. Chang's anxious ledgers, felt something different. He closed his eyes for a moment, not in defeat, but in contemplation. The pain was still there, a monstrous beast gnawing at his bones, but it no longer consumed him. It was a separate entity, something he could observe, acknowledge, and then, remarkably, set aside. He opened his eyes, meeting Dr. Sharma's gaze with a steady, almost serene intensity that startled her. "Thank you, doctor," he said, his voice raspy but clear. "I appreciate your honesty. What are our options for pain management? And what's the projected timeline, given this new information?" Dr. Sharma blinked, taken aback. "Well, we can adjust your medication. We're also considering localized radiation for symptomatic relief, though it won't halt the overall progression. As for timeline, it's difficult to say precisely, Daniel. Weeks to a few months, likely." She paused, then added almost hesitantly, "Are you all right? You seem unusually calm." Daniel managed a weak smile. "I am, doctor. More so than I've ever been, despite the circumstances. This pain, it reminds me I'm alive. And as long as I'm alive, there's work to be done." He used his hospital stay not as a period of retreat, but of unexpected connection. The bed next to him was occupied by a young woman named Chloe, no older than Alara, battling a particularly virulent form of leukemia. She was terrified, her parents hovering, their faces etched with despair. Daniel, despite his own discomfort, listened. He didn't offer platitudes or false hope. He simply listened, truly listened, to her fears about missing her graduation, about her parents' sacrifices, about the unfairness of it all. "It's okay to be angry, Chloe," he'd murmured one afternoon, his voice low. "It's okay to be scared, but don't let it consume you. There's still light even in the darkest places. Sometimes you just have to look for it in the small things, like the way the sun hits that window in the morning, or the taste of a truly good cup of tea." He then shared a story about Mrs. Henderson's stamp collection, not to sugarcoat his own situation, but to illustrate how finding purpose, even in the mundane, could anchor you. He meticulously explained how he'd helped her sort through the chaos, and how in doing so, he'd found a strange kind of peace. Chloe, initially withdrawn, began to open up, asking him about his work with Dr. Thorne, about the transcendent service. One evening, Beatrice arrived, her face strained with worry. She sat by his bedside, clutching his hand. "Daniel," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't understand. You're dying, and you're talking about organizing other people's lives? Why aren't you angry? Why aren't you fighting?" Daniel squeezed her hand gently. "I am fighting, Bea, just not the battle you think. The fight isn't against the cancer anymore. That fight I've lost. The true fight is against despair, against letting this illness steal my spirit. And I'm winning that one, Bea, every single day. I'm living, truly living, perhaps for the first time." He told her about Chloe, about the relief he saw in the young woman's eyes when he simply validated her fear, about the flicker of hope he saw when he shared his own journey. He spoke of the quiet satisfaction of helping Mr. Chang untangle his finances, not for a fee, but for the sheer act of service. Beatrice, the pragmatic lawyer, who had always seen the world in black and white, stared at him, a profound confusion warring with a dawning awe on her face. Ilara, who visited daily, brought him a small, battered bird guide. "Dad," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "you still want to go bird watching? Even now?" Daniel smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile. "Not in the way I used to, Ilara. But I still want to witness the beauty in the world, and I want to help others find their own beauty, their own purpose, even when their world feels like it's crumbling. That's my new grid, Ilara, the human heart." His doctors, nurses, and even the hospital chaplain noted the remarkable shift. He was a patient in severe physical pain, yes, but he was also a source of quiet strength, a beacon of unexpected calm in the turbulent ward. He didn't complain. He asked insightful questions about his care, not to challenge, but to understand. He offered gentle encouragement to the staff, acknowledging their tireless work. His transformation was undeniable, a testament to a healing that transcended the physical, a profound inner peace forged in the fires of adversity. He wasn't cured, but he was undeniably, miraculously well. The hospital room, usually a sterile white canvas for despair, felt different this time. The pain, when it finally loosened its vice-like grip, left Daniel weak but strangely clear-headed. He watched the IV drip, a steady rhythm marking the passage of time, and felt a profound detachment from the screaming agony that had brought him here. Dr. Albright, the oncologist whose face usually bore the weight of bad news, stood at the foot of his bed, reviewing charts with a slight frown. "Daniel," she began, her voice softer than usual, "the scans confirm what we suspected. The progression is significant. We're seeing new lesions, and the tumor in your femur has grown. We'll need to adjust your pain management, explore some additional palliative radiation options to target localized areas. But I need to be frank. We're moving into a more aggressive phase of symptom management." A few months ago, these words would have been a death knell, a final crushing blow to his carefully constructed denial. He would have felt the familiar icy dread, the tightening in his chest, the urge to curl into a ball and disappear. But now, as Dr. Albright spoke, Daniel found himself listening not with fear, but with a curious, almost academic interest. He nodded slowly. "I understand, doctor. What are the side effects of the radiation? Will it impact my energy levels? I've found a new rhythm, and I want to maintain it as much as possible." Dr. Albright paused, her frown deepening, not in concern, but in bewilderment. "Your energy levels? Daniel, you were in screaming agony just hours ago. Most patients in your condition, with this level of progression, are, well, they're usually in a very different place emotionally. You seem incredibly composed." A gentle smile touched Daniel's lips. "I am. I found a purpose, doctor, a profound one. The pain is part of the journey, not the destination. It's a reminder of what I'm fighting for, or rather, what I'm living for." He gestured vaguely with his free hand. "Could you tell me more about how the radiation might affect my mobility? I've been helping a blind gentleman with his budgeting. He relies on me for his daily walks to the post office. I don't want to let him down." Dr. Albright exchanged a look with the nurse, who simply raised an eyebrow. "We can certainly manage the pain, Daniel, and we'll monitor your mobility closely. But your outlook? It's truly remarkable. We've seen patients with far less aggressive diagnoses struggle with emotional despair. You've found something extraordinary." Later that day, as the new pain medication began to take effect, Elara arrived, her face etched with worry. She'd rushed to the hospital the moment Beatrice called. "Dad! Oh God, Dad, are you okay? Beatrice said it was bad. Really bad." She clutched his hand, her eyes scanning his face for signs of the despair she'd grown accustomed to. Daniel squeezed her hand gently. "I'm okay, Elara. I'm here. The pain was intense, yes, but it receded. And I learned something valuable from it." Elara blinked, her brow furrowed. "Learned what? That your bone is trying to explode?" "No," Daniel chuckled, a surprisingly warm sound. "That even at its worst, it's a sensation. A powerful one, but still just a sensation. And it passes. What remains is purpose." While I was lying there waiting for the paramedics, all I could think about was Mr. Henderson's stamps and Mrs. Davies, the caregiver I'm helping organize her patient notes. Their needs felt more urgent than my own pain. It sounds insane, I know, but it's true. Elara sat back, tears welling in her eyes, but these were different tears. Not of sorrow, but of profound relief and bewilderment. "Dad, you're different. You're really different. I've never seen you like this." The following days in the hospital were a testament to Daniel's transformation. He became a quiet force on the ward. Confined to his bed, he began to observe. He noticed the young man across the hall, barely out of his teens, racked with anxiety over his mounting medical bills. Daniel, despite his own discomfort, had the nurse pass a message. "Tell him I used to be an accountant. If he wants help making sense of those statements, I'm here. No charge." Soon the young man, hesitantly at first, was bringing his paperwork to Daniel's bedside, and Daniel, with a focus that transcended his physical pain, meticulously organized the documents, highlighted key figures, and even helped him draft an email to the hospital's financial aid department. He listened, truly listened, to the young man's fears, offering not platitudes but practical, actionable advice, laced with an unexpected warmth. He extended the same quiet compassion to others. An elderly woman, disoriented and lonely, found solace in Daniel's calm presence as he patiently helped her untangle a knot in her knitting yarn. listening to her fragmented stories of her youth. A frustrated father, pacing the halls, received a surprising offer from Daniel. "If you need someone to just listen without judgment about anything, I'm a good listener. My daughter says I'm incredibly boring, which makes me ideal for confidential information." Ilara and Beatrice, who visited daily, watched in awe. Beatrice, ever the pragmatist, was floored. "Daniel, you're radiating. What on earth did Dr. Thorne do to you?" Daniel simply smiled. "He helped me see beyond the numbers, B, beyond the prognosis. He showed me that true value isn't measured in years, but in connection, in purpose." He turned to Ilara. "Ilara, could you bring me my notebook tomorrow? The one with the green cover. I have some ideas for Dr. Thorne's program. We need a better system for matching participants based on their specific needs and the skills of the servers. And I want to start documenting the emotional impact, the return on investment of compassion, if you will." He was discharged a week later, his physical symptoms still very much present, and new palliative treatments in motion. But his spirit was undeniably vibrant. The pain, while gnawing, no longer held him captive. It was a backdrop, a constant hum that he had learned to tune out, or rather, to integrate into his new reality. His home office, once a sanctuary of sterile order, now felt like a command center for a different kind of operation. His spreadsheets were still there, but now they were filled with names, needs, and notes on how best to provide transcendent service. He became a living testament to Dr. Thorne's philosophy, a man whose body was failing, but whose spirit blazed brighter than ever. He wasn't just participating in the program, he was leading it. He meticulously documented every interaction, every small act of service, every reciprocal moment of connection. He started calling it the Compassion Curriculum, a guide for finding meaning and purpose, not despite life's challenges, but through them. He taught new participants how to listen, how to observe, how to offer practical help with genuine empathy. One afternoon, sitting in his armchair, a familiar ache throbbing in his femur, Daniel looked out at the bird feeder he'd neglected for so long. A cardinal landed, its red plumage a stark, vibrant contrast to the winter bare branches. He felt a profound sense of joy, a lightness he hadn't known was possible. It wasn't the joy of a problem solved or a goal achieved. It was the joy of being, of connecting, of giving. His healing wasn't a physical reversal, but a spiritual awakening, a profound shift that had made his life richer, more meaningful, and more vibrant than he could have ever imagined. He was still Daniel, the accountant, but now he was also Daniel, the illuminated guide. The hospital room, usually a sterile white canvas for despair, felt different this time. The pain, when it finally loosened its vice-like grip, left Daniel weak but strangely clear-headed. He watched the IV drip, a steady rhythm marking the passage of time, and felt a profound detachment from the screaming agony that had brought him here. Dr. Albright, the oncologist whose face usually bore the weight of bad news, stood at the foot of his bed, reviewing charts with a slight frown. "Daniel," she began, her voice softer than usual, "the scans confirm what we suspected. The progression is significant. We're seeing new lesions, and the tumor in your femur has grown. We'll need to adjust your pain management, explore some additional palliative radiation options to target localized areas. But I need to be frank, we're moving into a more aggressive phase of symptom management." A few months ago, these words would have been a death knell, a final crushing blow to his carefully constructed sense of control. He would have felt the familiar icy grip of fear, the bitter resentment that his body had betrayed him, the overwhelming sense of being a victim. But now, as Dr. Albright spoke, Daniel felt an odd sense of calm. The details, the medical jargon, the grim prognosis, they were facts, data points on a spreadsheet, and like any good accountant, he could process data. "Thank you, doctor," Daniel said, his voice a little hoarse from the pain and the effort of speaking. "I understand. What are the options for the localized radiation, and what are the side effects we should anticipate?" Dr. Albright paused, her frown deepening slightly, but this time with a hint of surprise. "Well, for the femur, we could consider a short course to reduce inflammation and pressure on the nerve. The side effects would be typical: fatigue, skin irritation in the treated area." For the new lesions, we'd assess their size and location. But Daniel, are you all right? You seem remarkably composed. A faint smile touched Daniel's lips. I am, doctor, more than I've ever been. It seems my focus has shifted from fighting the inevitable to living the available. I'd like to understand the practicalities. How long would such a radiation course take? And what would be the best way to manage any fatigue, given I still have a few projects I'd like to see through? Doctor Albright spent the next 20 minutes outlining the palliative care plan, her initial surprise slowly morphing into a quiet respect. Daniel absorbed every detail, not with a sense of dread, but with the pragmatic efficiency of someone planning a complex final project. He asked about medication schedules, potential interactions, the optimal timing for physical therapy to maintain as much mobility as possible. He was still Daniel, the meticulous accountant, but his balance sheet now included the invaluable, intangible assets of time and empathy. Later that afternoon, Ilara and Beatrice arrived, their faces etched with worry. Ilara, seeing the familiar IV pole, immediately knelt by his bed, tears welling in her eyes. Beatrice, ever the lawyer, was already pulling out a notepad, ready to cross-examine the doctor on every last detail. Daniel, oh, Dad, Ilara choked out, her hand finding his. When Mrs. Henderson called, I was so scared. Are you in a lot of pain? It was intense, sweet pea, Daniel admitted, squeezing her hand. But it's managed now. I'm discharged tomorrow. Just a few adjustments to the pain meds and a short course of palliative radiation. Nothing we can't handle. Beatrice, who had been listening intently, finally spoke. Palliative radiation? Daniel, what does that mean? Are they giving up? I spoke to Dr. Ramirez at Sloan Kettering. She mentioned a new trial for resistant chondrosarcoma, though it's experimental, and Daniel held up a hand, a gentle, almost serene gesture that immediately silenced his usually voluble sister. Beatrice, calm down. It means we're focusing on quality of life, on managing the symptoms so I can continue to live. Dr. Thorne would call it expanding life, not just prolonging it. His sister's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment. She looked at him, then at Ilara, then back at him as if trying to reconcile the haggard man she'd seen collapse just hours ago with the calm, almost radiant individual now addressing her. Dr. Thorne? Daniel, are you well? You don't sound like yourself. I don't feel like my old self, Beatrice. I feel like my true self, Daniel replied, a genuine smile reaching his eyes. And I have work to do. Over the next few days, Daniel's hospital room became an unexpected hub of quiet activity. Despite the lingering pain and the fatigue from the new medication, he was anything but withdrawn. He found himself conversing with the nurses, not just about his own care, but about their challenges, their exhaustion, the subtle signs of burnout he now recognized with an uncanny clarity. He offered a young, overwhelmed intern a simple, effective method for prioritizing her tasks, drawing on his accounting principles to deconstruct her chaotic schedule. He listened patiently to Mrs. Rodriguez, a woman in the next bed struggling with post-surgical depression, simply holding her hand and letting her talk until the trembling in her voice subsided. When Dr. Albright made her rounds, she often found him chatting with other patients, a gentle, attentive presence. She once overheard him explaining to a bewildered elderly gentleman how to set up his new smartphone, breaking down the complex instructions into simple, manageable steps, just as he had once done for complex tax codes. He even helped a frustrated patient advocate navigate a particularly thorny insurance claim using his knowledge of financial systems to untangle the bureaucratic mess. His strength wasn't physical, it was a profound inner resilience, a quiet wellspring of compassion that seemed to deepen with every passing hour. He wasn't ignoring his condition, he was simply refusing to be defined by it. The cancer was progressing, yes, but Daniel was too. He was learning to live in the face of death, and in doing so, he was teaching everyone around him how to truly live. The day of his discharge, Dr. Albright stood by his bed, a thoughtful expression on her face. Daniel, she said, I've been in this profession for 25 years. I've seen patients fight with fury or succumb with despair, but I've never seen anyone embrace it, quite like you. You're still facing a difficult prognosis, But your spirit, it's truly remarkable." Daniel nodded, his gaze distant for a moment. "The pain, doctor," he said softly. "It's still there. It's a part of me now. But it's also a constant reminder that I'm alive, and that as long as I have breath, I have purpose. And a lot of people out there, they need a little help balancing their ledger, not just financially." He looked at Alara, who stood by the window, her face tear-streaked, but with an expression of profound awe. Then at Beatrice, who was, for once, just listening, a rare softness in her eyes. "There's so much to do." The miracle wasn't a disappearing tumor. It was the emergence of a self that was more vibrant, more alive, more deeply connected to the world than he had ever been, even as his physical body continued its natural, inexorable decline.